Hi, mystery writers. Today we're going to follow up on last week when we talked about the first half of your mystery. And today I'm going to follow up and go along from that midpoint where something happens and your detective has to step back, take a whole new look at everything. So I think that mystery writers have a great advantage here in keeping the middle from sagging um, up to the middle, up to the midpoint. Your detective delved into the evidence and the suspects of the victim's world. And as I mentioned last week, at this point is going to start narrowing down. Um, The essence of keeping a reader turning pages is heightened tension, and rather than episodic scenes where this happens and then that happens and then something else happens, you create tension by throwing up increasingly baffling obstacles for your detective. And so we get a lot to play with in the second half of our story. In the chapters in the crisis after the middle, your detective gets glimpses of the killer's world. And these glimpses into the killer's world are the mystery writer's advantage because the detective enters a world within a world. Because the killer's world is inside the victim's world. So the first half, we were looking at the victim's world. And now your detective is going to get glimpses of that intersection between the victim's world and the killer. Okay. So your detective recovers from that crisis at the midpoint and gets their bearings and starts to dig deeper. They're stumped by recent events and they try to go back to their old interpretations, everything that they examined in that first half of your story. She reviews what suspects said, considers the victim's world, and pokes around in it, and completely still missing the key elements. She's regrouping, but she sees nothing new. And then as the story progresses, that opponent that we introduced in the first half throws up a roadblock as your detective goes out to find new resources. Um, like histories of the victim and new knowledge of the victim's world. But your detective's idea isn't getting him or her closer to the killer at this point. Um, if you're looking at story structure, this is the fourth complication in your story. And so the detective is out again in the victim's world and they make a stab at connecting the suspects that they've met so far, but an inspiration suggests that they get background on the suspects and how they operate in the victim's world. And things get intense with the love interest, and they may say or do something that gives your detective new insight. So things are getting complicated, and although your detective doesn't know it, their new vision of the victim's worlds sets them in direct opposition to the killer. The detective doesn't know it yet, but the killer is starting to feel like your detective is getting too close and feeling that pinch. They may strike another victim, and the detective thinks that the two murders are related, but doesn't see how they're related. And then your detective world turns topsy-turvy. Uh, Maybe a seeming ally suddenly becomes an opponent, or at least antagonistic toward your character, or a reluctant suspect shares new information, and without knowing it, the detective is getting close to the killer, and the killer knows it and now plans ways to stop your detective. So here's your chance to make the complications complicated. This is the second pinch point in plot structure, and you want to make it hurt. You want to make it really, really tough for your detective. So, just as you highlighted your detective strength at the beginning, so highlight your detective's weaknesses as you go past the middle. You don't have to make this glaring. Um, for example, you can take your detective strength as far as it'll go until it becomes a problem, a hindrance. Um, if he's confident, take it to overconfidence so he misses an important detail. That's just an example. So you can plant new clues to the killer's identity and get suspects to misdirect your detective and allow your detective to look in the wrong places while the killer starts to feel the threat. You want to make, at this point in your story, you want to make your detective work hard for every piece of information. The aim in this section of the story, especially as we head toward that fourth act in our fourth act structure, the aim of this section is to make things as difficult for your detective as possible. So the closer that your detective gets to the killer, the more things get in the way. So think of it this way. The detective finds that killer's world inside the victim's world, but he hasn't found the killer yet. All right? And this is where you want to make the complications roll. Your detective screws up, asks for help from the wrong people, stumbles over their weakness, and if it's bad, bring it on. In the final act, your detective is going to dive deeper into the killer's world as the ultimate exploration of the victim's world. But right now, it's complications, it's trouble, your detective feels like they're on track, but they can't get the solution. So as you're developing your storyline, take some time to brainstorm some really nasty ways to confound your detective and threaten not just their discovery process, but the detective as well. It's going to pile on those complications. Uh, so before that final confrontation, it's one big mess. Everything is not working. Uh, so there's another murder, which we hinted about a minute ago, and your detective thought they understood the victim's world, but now they feel as though they're back to the beginning. There's a glimpse of the killer, but either the detective doesn't notice or it doesn't give it uh, attention that it deserves. And so they take some time to lick the wounds they have now and then look around. And as your detective finds new connections and alliances among the suspects he was unaware of earlier, now he realizes that he overlooked important information way back there in Act 2. And that needs new examination. So part of planning your story is doing that setup earlier in the story so that your detective can go, oops, I just completely overlooked that then. And these discoveries feel like a new beginning of sorts, but his opponent jams it up with a new attack, and this attack can take his eyes off the case and onto something personal, like a flaw that's holding him back. So you can use that opponent character, whoever they are, to totally disrupt your detective's main goal. So that flow, emphasized by the opponent, it got your detective in a heap of trouble, and it's all the detective's fault. Uh, they may need to ask the opponent for a detail, or even ask that opponent for help. And your detective starts to question their vision of the victim's world as they have it so far. The love interest, if you have a love interest subplot, the love interest helps them look at that world in a different way. Uh, but your detective resists because it's not their way, it's that other character's way. All right. So your opponent encourages your protagonist to look at the victim's world in a new way, and he notices something new about the killer. And is it that easy, just shifting perspective? And of course, no, it's not that easy. Um, the killer uses a smoke screen, and the clarity fades. Everything the detective thought they understood, it just isn't making any sense. And the detective has one chance to confront the killer, but he has to clear his vision of the victim's world, and the antagonist gets away because your detective is still missing a piece of the puzzle. Okay, that's kind of a quick walkthrough of that second half up to the final act. Um, Basically, what you want to do is confuse your characters, and it's a hot mess. And um, this is where your detective struggles in every way. They struggle personally. They struggle with their attempt to solve the puzzle, and you get to mix things up, and you can mix them up a lot, and this is going to help you keep that long middle from sagging. um, you can switch things around, like the opponent um, may unknowingly give your detective an insight while trying to stop them, or the love interest may threaten to call it quits. The whole idea here is to make it complicated, to keep your reader guessing, but still you want to keep them guessing about how the detective will solve all these problems and solve the mystery. The other thing that's happening while all this confusion and complication is going on is that your detective is getting closer to the killer without knowing that they're getting closer to the killer. And even though your detective may overlook clues in the middle of the confusion, the killer feels the pressure, and the killer takes an active role. This is where they really become the antagonist and actively work against your detective, even if it's behind the scenes. Okay, that's the walkthrough of the second part after the middle. So it's like the third act of the four-act structure. I really hope that helps, because I do think that mystery writers have an advantage when it comes to keeping that middle from sagging, which is a big problem for a lot of novelists, because when we divide that middle up into the first part, discovering the victim's world, and the second part, getting closer to the killer and reinterpreting everything that the detective finds in the victim's world, we have a lot to play with. And so I think it's to our advantage to use everything that we can to keep that middle from sagging and keep readers turning pages. Okay, I hope that helps. Thanks for being a member of the studio, and I'll see you next week.